a long time ago now when we were on the Portrait Black Heritage Trail. And at our first tea talk, I think we had 20 people at the Discover Portrait Center. So we've grown since then. So I'll pass it over to Professor Konzett.
Hello, thank you, Jerry Ann, and thank you to the Black Heritage Trail for having this tea talk about the myth of the model minority. And what I wanted to do was just show you a PowerPoint about the myth of the model minority. Hopefully it will come up. Well, let's start from the beginning, if we could. Here we have, this is just a group, it's the myth of the model minority, and it's a model that came to the fore in U.S. culture in the post-World War II era, and was especially prevalent during the 1960s. It promotes Asians and Asian Americans as economically successful, having attained higher education, and therefore, therefore a higher representation a higher representation. Could we go back to the first screen? Thank you. A higher representation in white-collar and managerial occupations. Unlike other non-model minorities, they are seen as having been successfully assimilated into U.S. culture without government assistance programs. Now, Asians living in the U.S. are a diverse group. They're comprised of more than 22 million people, or 7% of the nation's population, according to the Census Bureau in 2019. They are the fastest growing group and will outpace the Hispanic population by 2060. The largest group hails from China, East Asia. The second largest group, which has, you can barely see, 4.3 million coming in. I do believe China has 4.6 million, India 4.3 million. They hail from South Asia and represented by especially India and a smaller group from Pakistan. The third largest group, coming up to almost 4 million, is from the Philippines, Southeast Asia. The smallest group is comprised by Pacific Islanders. Okay, could we move to the next page, please? Okay, so we have over 50 ethnic groups from over 40 countries with over 100 languages falling under the Asian American category, which is now called Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI for short. Among those, we have the well-known East Asians from China, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, the Southeast Asians from Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, or the Hmongs, who are the indigenous people who live in especially China, but also Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, or Thailand. South Asians from India and Pakistan, and Pacific Islanders from Hawaii, Samoa, Guam, Tahiti, Tonga, and other original peoples of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. The Filipinos can be and have been considered Pacific Islanders due to the island's complex history and its composition of well over 7,000 islands that stretch out over the Western Pacific Ocean. So you can see that it's a very large group of people and not at all monolithic. Because the myth was born in World War II and came of age in the 1960s, it is typically associated with World War II and Cold War allies and enemies, namely China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. Although South Asia, India, and Pakistan represent the second largest category, South Asians are not popularly considered Asian in the US. Very different from other parts of the world. Could we have the next page, please? Thank you. Now, why is this myth of the model minority dangerous? It came of age during the civil rights movement and was used not to draw attention to so-called model minorities, but to focus on non-model minorities, namely African Americans who were at that time demanding equal rights and equity in a segregated and racialized society. As the writer Frank Chen famously said, "Whites love us because we're not Black." Another point of the myth of the model minority is it places the burden of race and unequal opportunities on individual groups as opposed to the society as a whole, and thereby it ignores laws, policy, and social and cultural norms. It also pits minorities against one another. No one wants to be the low man on the totem pole or low person on the totem pole. And so it does that. It also turns diverse groups and cultures into a monolithic whole, ignoring various discrepancies of class, ethnicity, educational attainment, generation, sexuality, religion, and other markers of identity. So you can see how this myth of model minority upholds just a certain type, usually from Far East Asia or the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and usually works with those people and upholds certain elements while ignoring other aspects. Could we have the next page, please? Thank you. Okay, some of because film, and that's my specialty, I work in the English department, but I teach about film. Hollywood's representations of race and ethnic groups has formed powerful stereotypes and cliches, especially prior to the civil rights movement when we had more, where segregation was the rule. People learned about other cultures via film. So an early prototype of the model minority was Key Luke, who was Charlie Chan's #1 son. He played Lee Chan. And this is him in the 1937 film, Charlie Chan at the Olympics. Not only does Lee solve the crime alongside his father, saving the US, but he also wins gold in the 100-meter after rooting for Jesse Owens in the 100-meter. He's also a very skilled painter, and he's invited to a Paris exhibition. All these are where he's just doing just a marvelous job, you know, while also saving the US. So that is an early prototype of it, not a true one, but it's beginning. You already see the markings of it. Could we move to the next page, please? This is really probably one of the most popular and maybe arguably one of the first most articulated forms of the model minority stereotype. This is the 442nd Regiment. They were the counterpart of the Harlem Hellfighters, what is it, the 100th Regiment, I do believe, who fought in World War I and World War II. The Harlem Hellfighters were the most decorated during World War I. And in World War II, the 442 would be the most decorated regiment. And they made a movie, MGM, which was the big Hollywood studio, the #1 Hollywood studio, would do a very successful film called Go for Broke. And this is 1951, and it would star the original members of the original regiment alongside Van Johnson. He would be their regiment leader, and eventually come to work with them and know them and really get along with them and see how they were fighting. Like the Harlem Hellfighters, they believed that fighting in this war could bring them more acceptance and show how patriotic they were. They were one of the main reasons, the 442, they used them for Hawaii to gain statehood in 1959, because 20 times before that they'd been denied statehood because Hawaii is, the majority of people there are non-white. And so a lot of, especially the Southern Bloc, had voted against them and didn't want them in. However, with people like Senator Daniel Inouye, who had won all kinds of awards, Purple Heart, the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Bronze Star, and various, some sort of cluster, I think, because he lost his arm. He was used to justify statehood for Hawaii. But it remains one of the things of the assimilated, of this sort of model minority. Okay, and just some other examples of, could we go to the next slide? This is Crazy Rich Asians, a film that came out in 2018. Even though it has an all-star Asian cast, one of the first films, well, actually, there was one earlier in the 1960s starring Nancy Kwan, but I think this is more recent. 2018 all-star Asian cast, but they're all wealthy. And it promulgates that whole thing of the model minority. Next slide, please. Then we have Lulu Wang's indie film, The Farewell, which tells a national story about family globalism, and it stars Awkwafina. And this is, I think, a much nicer film that attempts to break that and shows how you have families when you come from 2 or even 3, because one of the sons lives in Japan as well. China, Japan, and the US, New York, with Awkwafina, and how do you, and they show them as just a typical regular family, not at all like Crazy Rich Asians. And you can really see the kind of indie genre marking it. Okay, and the final slide. This is Awkwafina is Nora from Queens. She's currently embroiled in some problems because of her black scent and her use of the African-American vernacular. But her film was her TV series, Awkwafina is Nora from Queens, is actually goes against this whole model minority. She still lives at home, even though she's in her late 20s. She's mixed Asian. Her father is, I think her father is Korean, and her grandmother is from, no, her grandmother is from China, and her mother was from Korea or something like that. But she's a hapless 20-something stoner who likes to play multi-video games and loves her vibrator as well, and attempting to make it in a gig economy. And we watch her always trying to make it. But it gives off a very different element. And what's interesting about Awkwafina is she doesn't have those typical fetishistic looks that you have typically on associated with stardom and all of that. She looks like a regular, typical person, and she acts like it, and is, just trying to make it and going from paycheck to paycheck, like various people, like the majority of Americans. And so here, and where they have her from Queens and all of that, it's quite interesting how it breaks that myth of the model minority, and having her being a mixed Asian who, really goes back and forth between various things, and yet, of course, claims Queens. She's mainly from Queens. So let me now just introduce our panel, and we'll then open up for discussion. So our first panel member is Pawn Nitichan. She's the executive director of City Year at New Hampshire. City Year, New Hampshire. Then Samuel, Sam, I'm trying to see, because Hyun over there, yeah. And he is an advocate and a public speaker. He also works with Michelle Wu, the mayor of Boston. And then we have Sandeep Bikram Shah, who's the senior program officer and racial justice advisor at New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. And they will introduce themselves and just give a discussion, and you can see from the various backgrounds that Asian Americans are not monolithic group, one whole group. My parents come from Hawaii and mixed with Filipino, Chinese, and Hawaiian. And I don't feel like I belong to Hawaii. And I don't feel like sometimes I don't feel like I belong in the US, but it's always a mix. So, oh.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that everyone can hear me well, both at home and here. Let's see if folks at home from Zoom can hear me well as well. So I would like to start with two simple stories, and I hope that the story can kind of provide a little bit of examples of the intersections of somebody like myself living in our state, and how my other people intersected with me, and how that might connect to the topic that we have this afternoon on the myth of model minority. So the first story, this is like about 25 years ago, and it took place just 10 blocks away from here. I was new to living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I was walking down the street. It's a nice summer day. And all of a sudden, I heard a sound of a child, "Daddy, Daddy." And I looked over, and literally she was like pulling on her father's hands, and with the other hand, pointed across the street at me and said, "Daddy, Daddy, Chinese woman," excitedly. I, of course, stop and I turn over, I smile, and I wave at her. The second story just happened maybe less than 2 years ago. This took place in Manchester, New Hampshire. I was on my way to my work and I got stopped. Somebody asking me for money. Manchester, New Hampshire is on Elm Street. If you go there, you see that we have a lot of people actually sometimes without a home and asking for money. And that particular morning, the person that asked me was a young woman, about the age of young people that I work with. And something was very compelling, and I stopped to talk with her and asked her about, is she need help? What she looking to? What's she gonna do with the money? Is she safe? I asked her if she's aware of some of the support services that are available in the community. And through that conversation, she had shared with me that she used to be a good student and she used to love learning and that she wanted to become a nurse. We talked for a while, and as best as I could, I tried to convince her not to give up on her hope, and that she seemed like a bright young person to me, and that there's a way to work her way back away from whatever that she's struggling with at the time. As we parted, she said to me, like, by the way, are you working at the nail salon across the street? So that's my second story. So going back to, I mentioned that I moved to New Hampshire about 25 years ago. So I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. First is that when I moved to New Hampshire, another note, right? The population in our state at the time is more than 98% white. I used to make a joke that by moving here, I moved the dial personally for our state. Fast forward now, I just mentioned Manchester. Manchester students population is now about 45% Black and brown students, 23% Hispanic, 10% Black, about 5% Asian. Things have shifted and changed quite a bit. When I came here, I immigrated to the US by choice, alone, to complete my education when I was 20 years old. I did not have families or relatives here. I arrived to the US as legal alien. I used to have a card that's saying that I'm a legal alien. I used to chuckle with that terminology a great deal, that I'm an alien being associated with the green creatures from outer space. Then, as I decided to stay in the US longer, I then became New American. And I was fortunate to be able to pass the exam and able to become later on citizen of United States of America. And now I'm considered Asian American. When I was in my home country, I was not a minority person. I chose to be here and therefore chose to become a minority person. To add some humor, I would say that back in my home country, average looking. And here, it seemed that from time to time, I got to be exotic looking. My language used to be my strength, and it became my weakness from people understanding me, my sense of humor, so on and so forth. And I was really short in my home country. I'll stand up for you. This is my height. And when I came to the US, I discovered that I'm extra, extra short. Lastly, a disclaimer. Even though it is true that I am an Asian person, by no means I'm expert about all things Asian. I'm not an academic and I'm well-versed on racial interactions and all of those things. That being said, I will be happy and pleased to answer any questions that folks may have. My hope is that our conversations today might bring perspectives, maybe insight and greater understanding, and that even in a small ways, if we can bridge the gap of understanding and appreciation so that ultimately our community is a little bit stronger, that will be really wonderful. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hyun. I did want to correct the record a little bit. The person I actually work for, I'm not here in any official capacity, but I'm working as the political director for Senator Sonja Diaz, who is running for governor in Massachusetts. I did work and volunteered, very much so on Sheldon's campaign. So there is some truth there. And I also previously served as the chairperson of the Massachusetts Asian American Commission. So, I'm incredibly grateful to be here in community with you all to be able to discuss the model minority myth And especially, wanted to really thank Jerry Ann and Heritage Trail for inviting us to be able to have and share this platform, right? Like, this is allyship, where you have members who are not part of the Asian American community opening up space and creating the opportunity for us to be able to engage in discourse that maybe you haven't done so before, but is absolutely critical, because it's not just about being nicer to people. It's not just about being kinder to folks. It's literally about saving people's lives. And 2 Asian American women over the past month have been murdered. One was followed into her home at 4 o'clock in the morning in New York City and stabbed 40 times. Another woman was pushed onto the New York subway trail. Then there are 2 Asian American women who haven't become high-profile stories, who were working as in massage parlors, and they were murdered. And yet, even despite what happened in Atlanta, the way that we stigmatize these women, the way that we view and understand and create and perpetuate these stereotypes and narratives about Asian women, that their bodies are disposable, we're continuing to allow and justify the murder and lives that have been taken away from folks who are our neighbors, our friends, folks that we come across, and maybe even our family members. So I just wanted to name that. And then another part I wanted to name was that I am an East Asian, straight East Asian male. My perspective and the advantages and the privileges that I hold are very different than those who, even for yourself and both of you, and even my mother who's here. Like, it's just, I'm nearly 6'2". Like, they're just going to be people who physically will not challenge me, but they're going to have this gumption to be able to go because of my mother. Little do they know that they actually have a better shot fighting me than they do fighting her. And so when we talk about these, it's incredibly important to name that. But I say that to say that I am not the spokesperson for the Asian American community. While I did hold a position in which I did speak for many, it doesn't mean that I have to share the perspective. And so I just want to always make sure that you don't just take my word for it, but speak to other people. Speak to the Desi South Asian community. Speak to the Southeast Asian community. Go and listen to why Pacific Islanders, specifically Hawaiians, are begging people not to come to Hawaii right now. Begging. Please don't come, right? And everyone ignores this. Oh, I'm just going on vacation. But it's that mentality of that you individually can make a difference, because it's not just the thought process that you're holding, but then the conversations you're having with other people that you're going to have that intrinsic impact on. Why is it that we look at the, Asian women's bodies as disposable? Well, that traces directly back to imperialism and how the U.S. Carried out wars in Asia. And what happened to the women in those countries, to the American soldiers? They served them as sex slaves. That's how their bodies were seen. What do you think those men and women came back to the United States afterwards thought about of Asian women when they saw them? Who do you think, what kind of conversations, how were they holding those conversations with other people who had never interacted with Asian people before? It's those narratives that may not seem like a big deal when you hear something, one person saying it over here, but that accumulates. And then becomes the narrative, the dominating narrative of how people who do not understand that perspective now carry that about you and then push it onto you. Now I'm going to get into that later about what it means to be Asian American in a bit. But I did also then want to give a little bit of a more lighthearted story that does also have some significance to it. I am the son of Korean immigrants. That's my mom right there. And like many of children immigrants, have had to play several roles in our households. Much of it was because my parents didn't fully understand the systems of a foreign country. So that struggle is a struggle that too many immigrant families, Asian American families being still very much so an immigrant community, that we have to deal with and endure. But it's also like whether it's understanding how to navigate the immigration system, not knowing how the political process works. How does one sign up for healthcare? When for the political system, as I'm engaged in it right now, so much of the Massachusetts caucus is done by people showing up to a caucus, and then they elect delegates, and you have to receive 15% of the delegate count in order to be on the ballot to be able to run for governor. How many people don't even understand that very simple process, just showing up and saying, you know what, I want to be a delegate. It's not a huge responsibility. It's a couple of hours of your entire year, every 4 years. But how many people don't engage in it because they don't simply feel like they're allowed to be a part of it, but their lives are heavily impacted by it? That's Asian Americans for you, where we're not allowed to be a part of the system that we're impacted by. And you may say, well, that's a choice of not entering, but there's also intrinsic things that happen that doesn't make you feel welcome, that doesn't feel like you're allowed to be a part of the process. And there's no explaining. So you want, like, imagine when my mom came 30 years ago, there wasn't a Google that you could go on and type in, what's a caucus? How do you become a delegate? Like, what's a city council? Like, and then what's a city council versus a select board versus town member? It's those things that you may not think twice about, but just feels like a barrier that's too difficult to overcome for other folks. And it's not because you're not supportive, not because you don't care, not because you don't want to help, right? Because we're all trying to survive here, right? We're all, it's this rat race that we're all constantly in. So one of my most vivid childhood memories is when I asked my mom to sign up for Little League. By the age of 10, I had completely fallen head over heels in love with baseball. I know I'm in New Hampshire, so I'm just going to assume that everyone here is a Red Sox fan. And if you're not, then we have a problem. We have other things to discuss. But I grew up watching Pedro, Mo Vaughn, Nomar Garcia Parra, Hideo Noble. Many of them were immigrants or children of immigrants. And I was completely desperate to be able to one day call family a part of my home, to the point where I had the unique opportunity to go on the field after the Red Sox won the World Series and be with the players before. Did I go and kiss the Green Monster? Absolutely, you bet you I did. But when I was younger, at 10 years old, when I begged my mom to sign me up for Little League, she didn't know where to go. You had to go ask someone, right? What a concept, asking someone for help, going up to them in this day and age and just going up to a stranger and asking them for help. What a concept. But that's what she had to do. And in spite of her insecurities and fears of speaking English, she did that because of her love for her children, right? That sacrifice of overcoming the anxiety, the fear of something you don't know, uncharted territory, because of she didn't just travel all the way across this world and leave her life behind in order to not provide the best opportunity she could for her child. And so when she told me that she had signed me up for Little League, I was over the moon. I was so excited. I was like, yes, Mom, you did it. Until I found out, I asked her, Mom, what Little League? And she said, Newton South Little League. I was mortified because I'm like, what is Newton South Little League? It's Newton Little League. That's what all my 9, 10-year-old friends were telling me is Newton Little League. So I was screaming, throwing a tantrum, having this, like I couldn't believe what was going on. My mom just sitting there feeling horrible because she's no, I did the right thing. I did what I had to do. And here we are in that 9, 10-year-old yelling at his mother who's doing the best that she can by herself to raise her children in a country that she has no idea anything about, barely speaks the language, doesn't know any of the systems, doesn't know the culture. And then turns out that I was wrong. Newton was so big, had so many resources that there were so many kids who wanted to play Little League that there were 5 Little Leagues, and my mom actually did sign me up for the right Little League. But it's that not knowing of systems, right? That is critically important to understand, is when it comes to the Asian American experience, model minority myth, there's this idea, this perpetuation that we don't need help, that we're successful, that we're rich. If you look at the median household income of Asian American households, it is the highest of any racial demographic. But what isn't told is that we also have the single largest racial wealth gap out of every racial group in the country. When you go to New York City, which is the most highly densely populated city in the entire country, the single largest group that's living under the poverty line are Chinese Americans, by far. You have communities within the Asian American community that are facing poverty rates at extremely high levels, well beyond every other racial group. But because of the number being distorted by a small handful of people within our community, and the way that data is then dispersed and not actually articulated in the way that we need it, there is this continual perpetuation stereotype that Asians are rich, that we don't need help, we don't need resources, we don't need to be invited into the room. And then we don't talk about how we then view Asians in positions of leadership. Asian Americans are more likely to become put in leadership positions, become the CEO of a company, when that company is going into bankruptcy. But when the company is on its way up, those people get fired or removed and are demoted and not allowed to go move higher up. That's called the bamboo ceiling. The idea that Asians were hard workers, that we're good when the times are rough, when you need us to do the dirty work, but when it's time for us to lift us up and to give us opportunities to succeed at the highest level, then that is no longer a place for us. That's not for you. Now, where does this go back to? It goes back to the model minority myth. When you saw a sociologist coin that term following Now, mind this is the timeline is really important here, right? It followed the release of Japanese Americans from internment camps after they were put there against their will and tortured. And then, of course, they're shell-shocked and fearful, and now, of course, and they're not going, and still may not speak English and have cultural barriers. And now, all of a sudden, you're the model minority. You're the model minority. Oh, good, patting on the head. Good job. You're quiet. You're obedient. You follow directions. You do what we tell you to do. You don't cause trouble. Good job, little Asian. Think about the audacity to say that to a community after you adjust and turn them against their will, ripped them from their homes, and then on top of that, bombed their family back home. It's this idea that, oh, you're doctors, lawyers, and engineers, you're doing well. Why is that? Because after the passage of the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, you saw the abolition of the immigration quota system. There was a brain drain from Asia. Who was allowed to come? Doctors, lawyers, engineers. But guess what those doctors, lawyers, and engineers weren't allowed to do? They weren't allowed to practice being doctors, lawyers, and engineers because your degree was no good here. You didn't go to Harvard. You didn't go to Yale. You didn't go to UC Berkeley. You went to Seoul National University. What could that school possibly be? Only one of the best universities in the entire world. So then we come here and we're not allowed to be the very jobs that we're brought here from to steal us from the place where we were. And then now we're allowed to set up businesses and we get bank loans, but no, not in white neighborhoods, in the black neighborhoods. Oh, you want to start a business? No, not in the white neighborhoods, but in the black and brown neighborhoods. And then now we're starting to build and start business and make money in industries that we may not have any historical context or cultural context for. And a lot of Asian-owned businesses are sell hair to black men and women. Not understanding the cultural context of what that holds, the amount of pain and the trauma that is actually behind that. So then there's the pitting of communities against one another. Oh, you're the model minority. Looking at black folks saying, if only you behave like those Asians, you wouldn't be receiving the treatment that you do. So when I came to the realization that the model minority myth was a justification of anti-blackness, that meant that even in my own oppression, I'm an afterthought. I am so unimportant in the eyes of the broader country, right? Not individual folks, but the broader country, that I'm an afterthought in my own oppression. But then because of the nature of the way that my oppression is structured, it then pits me against black and brown folks who are also being oppressed, who then become resentful because, oh, well, your stereotypes that you're smart and successful. That's a privilege. But to the person who's being oppressed, that's not a privilege because all of a sudden you're held to these standards and you have these ideas and stereotypes that are pushed onto you that may not be fair. I suck at math. It is a miracle that I got my MBA. A miracle. But I can't talk. Much to my mom's chagrin, I talk too much, but but it's these things, right? These ideas and these notions and these truths that are uncomfortable to listen to, but are critically important if we're going to actually build a world in which all of us, every single one of us, has an opportunity to be who we are freely without fear of judgment and persecution. For all of us to be able to say with a straight face, look at our children in the eyes and be like, I brought you into a world that's going to allow you the opportunity to be the best version of yourself, where you're going to be loved, valued, and held in all the ways that you need to be in order for you to contribute and create a loving society. And so when we have these conversations, right, I did want to drop these statistics before I conclude because I don't want to take up too much space here, but much of my work has actually been centered on the AAPI community. And specifically, much to combat the rising anti-Asian hate, but March 19th in 2020 to September 30th, 2021. Stop AAPI Hate reported 10,370 incidents of hate. That's just reported to one organization that not every single member of the community knows about. So of course, not everybody's reporting to them. So that is a fraction of what's actually happening. We don't just suffer from physical and verbal violence, though. Our community also faces the largest racial wealth gap. We're consistently ignored by government and philanthropy. where 0.01%, not 0.1%, 0.01% of all philanthropic dollars goes to Asian American organizations. 0.01. The model minority myth, the perpetual foreigner narrative, being the invisible race, erase the fact that we come from 21 different countries, we speak dozens of different languages, and we have different cultural traditions, religious beliefs, we have different food, different historical context with one another. Oh, and by the way, we've been at war with one another for hundreds of years as well. So, amazing that we don't get along. But erasing those parts of our story, of our trajectory, of our timeline, of our voices is also violence. Because it continues to perpetuate and allow the stereotypes to exist instead of allowing us to tell our story, allowing us to be able to speak for ourselves, and accepting us when we tell you who we are. And so, my hope and my aim when we have these conversations is that we can start to listen to one another. Because so much of the pain that we experience each and every day that we have inflicted on one another comes from misunderstanding, which comes from miscommunication. And that continues to perpetuate harm and trauma that's get passed from generation to generation. But we have an opportunity to stop that now. It may not happen today in this conversation among this room amongst us, but we can start that, right? We can plant those seeds. We can continue to challenge folks when they say something that is that is harmful, that is violent, that is hurtful. But maybe in the ones that are maybe a little bit more innocuous. Maybe it's just that little comment here that we might say, hey, come on, think a little bit different. Or we direct them to resources of people that we know that are educated, that are creating these conversations, that are having them. And be like, look, why don't you come with me, right? Offer to go with them because they may feel uncomfortable going alone, but go with them. Because you might learn something too, because I'm learning something every day. So I know my time is coming to an end. I really am incredibly grateful to be able to share this space with you all. And I hope and I know and I believe that we're going to create a better world together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see so many familiar faces here. Thank you, Jerry and Black Ridge's Trail team for giving us this opportunity to be here. Thank you for all of you who have joined here in person and virtually as well. And thank you to Delia and Sam for their thoughtful remarks. My name is Sandeep Bikram Shah. I live in Delhi. I work at New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. My title there is Senior Program Officer and Racial Justice Advisor. I've been living in New Hampshire for about over 5 years now. And before that, I was in Philadelphia, where I got my graduate degrees. Before that, I was in Berkeley, California. That's where I stayed most of my time ever since I've been in the US. Prior to that, I was in Nepal, Kathmandu, Nepal. I was born and raised there. For folks who don't know where Nepal is, it's a small country sandwiched between China and India. And no, I have not climbed Mount Everest. I get that question a lot. Right. So, yeah, it's not like one of those 4,000 tours that you can go and weekend. It's also packing. Just like most of you have seen it either on videos or on pictures. But jokes aside, when I was asked to come here today, I debated a lot about what to share or what to talk about because there's just so much. Like just hearing from Paul and Sam and Delia, just like there's just so much. It's a pretty complicated topic, and there's just not one easy answer. And as I was debating, do I talk about my personal experience being here in the US and in New Hampshire, or do I talk about professional experience because I get to work with other nonprofits in New Hampshire and a lot of communities here? Do I talk about my social work and public health practice, where I get to work with a lot of refugee groups from Bhutan to Cambodia to Vietnam, and none of them fit into this model minority myth. Right? None of them had this so-called economic success or so-called high degree attainment. These folks were all struggling. So as I was debating, I had a meeting with a colleague last week in Massachusetts, and she wanted to share about her experience recently, and it was clearly bothering her. She is Vietnamese American, born here in the US, and her parents were from Vietnam. And recently her house had burglarized. And on top of that, 3 other houses were burglarized. But one common theme was they all were Vietnamese Asians. And so she was scared for her family, for herself. She didn't know what to do. She was not sure. She wanted to bring attention to this, but then she was not sure about the consequences and what it could be. But that's not a new story, right? We have heard that story so many times in the last 2.5 years. Like some of the stats that Sam mentioned earlier, it's pretty heartbreaking. And some horrifying stories that has come up. But those are the reports, those are the news that haven't actually been reported. What about the news that has not been reported? Being persecuted for something that they have not done. And it does not really have to be physical attack, right? And then these attacks could be verbal as well. I have a family member who was born and raised here. And not too long ago, her high school classmate posted her picture on Snapchat with the caption, "Stay away from COVID." That's in New Hampshire. And I asked her, like, what did you do? She's like, it's not worth it. Not the first time this has ever happened anyway. And I'm like, tell me, what's going on? So she was like, well, during middle school, one of my classmates came to me. And one of my classmates came to me and told me I'm going to go to hell because I don't celebrate Christmas. Or one time when I was 7 years old, I was in Walmart and this woman walks to me and tells me, "You brown people are stupid." So this has been happening for a number of years. And the response was always, it's not worth it. Right? Why is not worth it? Why are we talking about this? Is this so-called burden of being this model minority that you have to act a certain way, you have to behave in a certain way, or this perpetual, foreign stereotype that you're always seen as an external, like as an outsider, and you don't necessarily belong there, or this is not necessarily your problem. But that's a difficult question to answer. So when I introduce myself, I give you a list of different places that I have lived in the US. And that's literally the answer that I have to repeat myself constantly. That I get asked the question, where are you from, all the time? And when I say they're in Hampshire, that's not a satisfying answer. They're like, where are you really from? So it's hard, right? Those questions kind of reminds you that no matter how long you have lived in this country, like I've lived here in the US for over 20 years, and I'm still seen as foreign. And it might be like a nice icebreaker thing, and that person might not be trying to hurt intentionally, but that's how you see me as, right? Like an outsider. But what about like my friend or my family member who was born here? What if you ask that question to them? What is their answer? And it's hard, right? For them, being born here is not good enough. They are not American enough. So that's the reality of this. Looking forward to the questions later on, but I'm grateful for this space and I'm glad that we have this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, we can open up the floor for any questions. We can open up the floor for any questions that you may have, that you'd like to ask. Or we can also continue just talking amongst ourselves. I just wanted to, oh, there is.
So other than this opportunity that we have, which is very grateful for, what other opportunities do you suggest to us as people here are here for a reason? They want to do it. And after we hear from our friends, hey, just like you said, it's get a bunch of people to go to something similar. So we know you're from Mass, but the rest of the contingent, the Mass is not that far. What other opportunities are there any opportunities? Is there any opportunities that we can engage in with your groups to show support, find out what your needs are, so we can support them, and we can just get a better understanding, making recommendations, and catch a lot of us. Sorry, can I ask you to repeat the question because the new people won't hear on this meeting?
Okay, say that again.
Yeah, speaking of little helps, we're gonna be good. Can you repeat the question that's asked on the floor? Mike said he wants to ask the floor.
Oh, okay. So I only heard part of the question, maybe because of the mask, but you were asking how can ways in which you can help, and what are some of the things that you can do in order to push forward a dialogue, or is okay.
So there's a couple different things, right? There's, in terms of if you're looking for already established organizations and such, like there's Haters of Virus, that puts out a lot of information to stop AAPI. There's also, I do really recommend Back. What they do is bystander intervention training. They have a system called the 5Ds that they go through in order to make sure that you're able to step in and be an ally and to make sure that you're safe too, right? So it's ensuring the safety of the person, the victim, but also yourself who's choosing to step up and creating, defusing the situation. So Back, they do great work there. And Haters of Virus, also what that organization does is it will point you in the direction of resources to be able to learn more and understand and engage with Asian American organizations that have been putting in a lot of educational resources for years. And so there's that one way. I'd also say in terms of support, is you can take the initiative yourself to be able to say, hey, why don't we, put together an event and within my own neighborhood or hometown or whatever, if you at your workplace or if you're work at an education institution, to be like, hey, why don't we bring in speakers and to create these ourselves? We're going to take the initiative and then go find folks and just like Jared, to create this here and don't do it right before AAPI Heritage Month. That is typically when a lot of speakers are very much booked. And so if you take the initiative now to try to book someone, you're probably much better off doing that. But there's a lot of resources online, and really try to tap into the local organizations that are around. They probably need your help the most. Oftentimes what I found, and when I was at Haters of Virus, what we did was we raised money and distributed it to grassroots organizations. They're so overstaffed or understaffed and overworked that they don't really have the time to be able to go out there and put on fancy fundraisers. They don't have the resources for that. But if we can all just chip in, right? Like the amount of the difference that we can make, that accumulating factor of $5, $10, $15, $20. So, I'm sure there are organizations that are around you, or if not, there are organizations that will point you in the right direction.
And just quickly as well, and then putting New Hampshire in context, it'll be, I was talking to one of the community members, and one thing she shared, few weeks back was the burden is always on us to educate others. Like the burden is always on us to tell them we exist here. What is the other side doing? And that really hit hard because I'm trying to build a relationship with that community as well. I'm not talking about the Asian American community now, I'm talking to people abroad. But we always expect others to come and help us, get informed. So I guess, so the lesson for us is what are we doing? Are we really reaching out? Do we really know who exists here in Hampshire? Do we know that not too far away from here in some sort of just area, is a continuation? There are about 2,500, 3,000 Indonesian people living in Hampshire, and majority of them are actually living in somewhere of the Rochester area. And do we know that they're there, right? And what are we doing to know them? So I guess it's more about us as well, and not just wait for them to come to us.
Are there other questions before I think about that?
I have one from online, but if you want to answer that one first.
To add to the points that have already been made, I'm a big fan of personal interactions, and I think that the kindness, thoughtfulness is always so important. Also, there are organizations that support minorities organizations in our communities. I think that they are also good connections. I would say this though, that when the incident in Atlanta happened, practically no one reached out to me. And the connection never got made in my friends, family, to say like, wow, she could potentially relate to that incident as an Asian woman. And I felt really, really alone. And this is not to say that friends and family are not thoughtful people, but sometimes we just miss those connections. So I think that you showing up here is expressions of care, which I appreciate, and I think that continue to kind of asking ourselves and continue to care. So thank you.
I'm a huge fan of reading. A huge fan of, here things can come up. Huge fan of reading, and reading Asian American authors can sometimes help. Going to the local library and asking them for, to order Asian American authors, or, if they have any books, asking them to look them up. That's also quite a good idea.
There is Making of Asian America by Erica Lee is a must read. There's also The Wake Up by Michelle Kim that I highly recommend. What The Wake Up talks about is how do you go from good intentions to good impact? How do you actually go from having a heart of wanting to help people and support them, but actually feel helpful for that they need it, not how you perceive that their needs are. So I highly recommend Michelle's book. I also recommend Erica Lee's book. I would definitely research Corky Lee, the work that the late great photographer Corky Lee did. And then there's also the work of Edward Said and other folks who you may not immediately think about as Asian American, but have contributed massively to the discourse surrounding Asian American history and experience. So I definitely push yourself outside the boundaries of what you think you understand of Asian Americans outside of the station. And also definitely find books and authors that are written by Southeast Asian, South Asian, Central Asian, West Asian authors as well.
Yeah, I really recommend Midnight's Children by Rushdie. What's Rushdie's first name? Midnight's Children. It's a wonderful thing about the when Pakistan and India are separated. A wonderful story about food and everything.
Okay, I have a question from online. Would you be willing to comment on how the myth of the model minority contributed to the lawsuit filed by students for fair admissions versus the president and fellows of Harvard College, which alleges discrimination against Asian Americans and concerns how affirmative action program is being implemented in Harvard's student admission process? Anyone?
Yeah, that's a complex question.
Yeah, no, this is either going to get me in trouble with people or, because there's a lot of really strong feelings on this. I think one of the things that people need to understand is when you look at the conversation started from action on Asian Americans in particular, you have to understand the context of where a lot of these Asian people are, predominantly these Asians that are both up in arms about affirmative action and where and why this is happening. Right? So when you go to countries like Korea, or Korea, for example, there was one test. You don't do well on that one exam as a high school student, your life is pretty much finished. So you have to think about the idea that culturally where people are coming from is that, and this is not just a recent phenomenon. For generations in Korea, it's exams. You exam to become civil servant. Exam to become, and that's the mindset.
It's a lot of
that people are
Asian
going to.
culture, yeah.
So you come here to this country that tells you if you play by the rules, if you do everything the way you're told, that you're going to be able to succeed. As a merit-based system is what we're told. That's not true. Because over 43% of Harvard-admitted students are who are white are actually legacy, children of faculty, athletes, and it turns out the study showed that 73% of those white students and 43% would not have gotten into Harvard if they were not one of those four designations. So who's actually taking up the seats that are undeserving? Is it them, or is it the black and brown student who went to a underprivileged, under-resourced school system in inner city, in an inner city, trying to also go to work after school while trying to study and scored maybe 50 points below, and then had a GPA that was 2% below? Who's more deserving of that opportunity? The kid who overcame unbelievable amounts of barriers, or the kid who had a silver spoon in his mouth and took up the seat because of who they knew? But then what's happened is Ed Blum, who is a right-wing activist, who's been the one driving to use there was a case of a white female student at the University of Texas. That was the first case that they used to try to scale back and eradicate affirmative action. And then they realized, Ed realized, hey, I have a demographic of people that can tap into and weaponize their anger and pain into pitting them against black brown students. So that is what spurred the Harvard case. And the hard part of trying to wrap my mind around is like, yes, there were definitely discrimination against Asian American students in particular, right? But also a misunderstanding of what is valued in the college admission process. Why is it that they really appreciate student athletes? Why is it that they appreciate student body presence? Why is it that how you conduct yourself in an interview is important in terms of being able to get a job or acceptance? Right, those things that if you know the system, that you understand. So when all of a sudden you think you did everything by the book, your child got a perfect score in SATs, got 4.0 GPA, all these clubs, and all of a sudden you're not getting into Harvard, and then you got somebody telling you it's that person's fault. That is what's happening with affirmative action and the ties to the bottom minority and why it's so is creating so much tension. But there is a real problem that is happening. But it's not the root cause that may not be the root cause of something. So many people that might falsely believe that it is.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the affirmative action program has been quite controversial, and people are asking to do away with all kinds of race-based elements and all of this. It has an issue to do with with equity and those sort. Can you still hear me? can you, equity and all of that. One, I think last week it was brought up, the issue finally of legacy, and especially at prestigious schools, they hide the numbers of legacy applicants because it's tied to the endowment, and they do not like to admit. I was taught for a while at Yale, and they hid the legacy numbers, and it was rumored to be as high as 40%, and that's because it ties into the endowment. You're getting the numbers, you're getting all this donations from people who and they expect to have their children, their grandchildren, and the other, and whoever they pay for to come in and be a part of that school. And it's especially at prestigious schools. However, in California, there's been some problems because of population or whatever. But it's a very difficult and controversial question.
I have a question, change the dialogue a little bit. So lately, Korean dramas, K-pop plays, have been really getting a lot of attention. And there's been a lot of vitriol between Black Americans and Asian Americans. And I wanted to know what you think the differences between culture appreciation and culture appropriation.
Yeah, the question was, with the rise of a lot of like East Asian media, in particular, that has led to really difficult conversations between the Black and Asian communities, specifically around cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation, and some added context for that would be you see a rise, like Aquafina, for example, you see these Asian Americans who are now becoming stars in rapper Asian American rappers, and also much of like the K-pop derives a lot of its inspiration from Black artists, Black American artists in particular. And so where do you draw the line between cultural appreciation and appropriation? I think a lot of it has to do with a lot of that conversation has to come from internal. I think the Asian American community has to have that internal conversation about how do we talk to our family members back in say Korea, Japan, and educate them, be like, look, I understand you're doing it because you think this is awesome, you love it, you're passionate about it, but you need to understand the cultural context of what you're doing and why it's not okay to wear box braids, why it isn't that Black Americans get upset with that, and when you use a Black accent, oftentimes why is it attributed to Black people, right? And so these cultural context conversations do need to happen, and there is that tension that does exist. And for me, at least, and this is just my personal opinion, cultural appreciation is when you know the historical context behind it, when you know the nuances, when you've done the history, and you're doing it as a way to celebrate, to uplift, but also you listen. You listen when the community tells you you've gone too far, you need to scale it back. That's not for you. And then be able to respect that. And that's where the cultural appreciation comes in. Appropriation comes in when you completely disregard the asks and the wants of a community that you are trying to quote unquote appreciate. But then you said, you know what, I don't care. I do what I want because that's what I want to do, and what my needs and desires supersede how this may be harmful to you. And so when someone continues to, let's say, use a Black accent and use that privilege to make their career and profit off of it, but Black folks, simply for being themselves, can't get these same opportunities as opposed to somebody who's opposing and using the verbiage and to advance themselves.
I also do think that when you a more sophisticated understanding of culture and the way it works with, between this appropriation and I don't think that we are still in this binary system, and we cannot. It's very difficult to look at shades of gray, and we need to do that a bit more. And it is about communication, asking, why doesn't a group of people enjoy this, or what are they protest about it? How do they feel they're being disrespected? All of that, and it makes it quite difficult, especially in a capitalist society where profit is the number one key thing, and you have to make money when you can make money, and that's the kind of driving force there. But I think if we sit and listen and try to have these sort of dialogues, that does somewhat that does somewhat help. It makes it difficult. It's so difficult to have a democracy in which everyone speaks and wants to be respected. It's so much easier to have a fascist society in which we're just told what to do and one person decides, or a group of people decide. That is so much easier to run and do, which is now it's getting so where we're trying to be more nuanced. But I think it'll come along. Speaking of K-pop and all of that, I just recently read an article, I believe it was in the BBC, about K-pop and BLM. They're really pushing the Black Lives Matter. And there a lot of elderly fans are joining in and learning about BLM via K-pop, and helping to discover why K-pop bands are certain groups are upholding BLM, and doing all of this, and joining them on Instagram, on social media, and other groups, and all of that. So I think that's kind of interesting, where that kind of dialogue is going on, even though it might be fan-based and, driven by capitalist motives and all of that. But it's still quite interesting.
Okay, this is just a comment from someone from Needham has a question for Sam. When are you going to run for city council or mayor in Newton? State rep works too. So question for any panelist. The model minority myth has perpetuated the idea that AAPI populations don't have the same struggles in the US as other minorities. We know this myth pits various minority groups against each other, but can someone speak to us about this impact of this myth within Asian groups? Does the myth pit Asians against Asians? And if so, are there recommendations for mediating the harm that this causes?
I'll start for us. On the second questions, certainly, I think that, oops, thank you. Hello? Can you hear me now? Hello? Yeah. Good. So the answer is absolutely. I think that Sam mentioned earlier, you also mentioned earlier about there's so many countries and villages and languages mixture that made up this Asian. And I would say that even with people within the same country, same language, there's a division there. I mean, we experience it here, and I would say that in Manchester, there are large populations of Vietnamese, and there are Vietnamese that live on the east side of town and the west side of town, and there's a separation there. And then you add class into the mix. If you come from the same exact country, same language, But if you come from upper class family, your experience, your reality can be entirely different than somebody from struggling economic background. That adds tremendously the complication that we're talking about here. And I would say that even in the social setting, if you meet somebody for the first time, people that speak the same language and experience a lot of difficulties as a minority in this community are trying to size each other up. Where exactly are you from, and what is your positions? So I that's really good questions, and it's very much so that there's huge complexity and divisiveness even within.
It's a great question. And yes, Konzett, it happens quite a bit. One thing also is helpful to understand is so there are two types of migration. One is voluntary and one is involuntary migration. Okay, so when you're talking about refugee population, that's involuntary migration. So they don't really get to choose where they go. You know, they were over 60,000 Philippines who settled in the United States and 7 other different countries all around the world. They didn't really get to say where they want to go. And then when US was big, they didn't really couldn't make a choice between New Hampshire versus Hawaii. Right? So they, they're both likely to go there. But when it comes to scale migration, then there's a total different ballgame there. Like you need to think, you have the caste system is huge, social class is huge, so you get to pick very good, and then when you are part of the community, it's natural to feel that way. But I guess that's common in all the other cultures as well, not just the Asian Americans.
And my name is and I that has been said, that's true. I think. I'm from Southern Ohio, and Southern Ohio, Northern Ohio. So it was the Southern and Southern Ohio was more of the southern states, the culture, the language, and I lived in Southern Ohio until I was 24. And since that age, I moved 19 times because of business. That's around the country, internationally. Everyone in this country is so different, and cultures are different. And when I first moved up here north, I still spoke like I was from the south. And the children wait one day and then started asking me questions about where I was from and everything. The way I pronounced everything was really hard to understand. He said it was from me. And I pronounced, for instance, the word "will" instead of "ever." I think that's what happened. And he questioned me about what is that word? What does that word mean? And I was embarrassed. And so when I am trying to explain to people, I try to do the same thing, but not to understand it because I want. And where I go in this country, I'm accepted right away. I ask And so it's not always easy. And what I learned, I make the effort. And I feel that you're, I don't know, you're in a position where you have to make the effort.
And it's exhausting. It's exhausting. It's exhausting trying to have to constantly be heard and be valued and be able to walk into a room and not have to be able to talk to myself over and over again. And what is it enough? You know, why are my standards so much higher? And it's exhausting trying to explain in my own humanity. Think about that, like how, like the reasons that we use to justify not giving other folks their humanity. I think one of the things I wanted to talk about really early that I forgot to kind of mention was oftentimes the racism that Asian Americans face gets reduced to a joke, or oh, it's just I didn't mean it that way, or you're being overly sensitive. Just calm down. But what is that also doing, right? Not only did we just experience vitriol, racism, hatred, but then we also got the agency, our human right to feel and have emotion and to own that stripped from us. So now we're not even allowed to feel that pain and anger because it was just a joke. I'm the one being sensitive. I'm the one being, and we end up being gaslit. And so it's like that. It's the death by 1,000 paper cuts where sometimes it's like one comment, 2 comments, 3 comments, 1,000 comments, and then you finally have enough and you snap, and then we wonder as a society, why did that person snap? Why did that person do that? Well, maybe you made one comment, but you were one of 1,000 people that did that, and therefore that pushed that person over the edge. And then we repeat this. We treat people the same way over again without making any adjustments. And then we wonder again, why did that person snap? We say thoughts and prayers. Oh my God, my heart and condolences to your family. That family lost their family. They just snapped. So to your point, I appreciate you bringing that up because it allows us to be able to express as much as strength and resiliency we're trying to show. Excuse my language, but we are fucking tired. Sorry, Mom.
I think that speaking as a woman to another woman, I can't imagine that you have experienced that. You mentioned moving and work. I think that if we add the gender layers to it, to be taken seriously in the professional setting, if I say something and my male colleague saying something, who got hurt, who get recognized. This is very common, but then when you're adding the race, language barrier, cultural barriers into the mix, it can be quite difficult and exhausting. And it's everywhere. I mentioned in the work environment, when you go into personal life, you go into the store and you happen to stand next to your wife, husband, colleague, the person to talk to you or you're asking questions to would automatically talk to the white person next to you in doctor's office, in every space, in restaurant, in the store, any places. Even if I am the one paying, it's still sometimes the check would come back to another person. And I think that it's a lot of assumption, but again, I imagine there's a lot of women in this room that you experience that of being seen as a secondary, and I think that again, adding all those barriers, it makes things so much more difficult.
happens to my mom all the time.
I know we could go on with these questions for a while, but it's almost time, and this is the last question, and I just chose to ask it if that's okay. So, Paul, you had talked about when you came to the US, you didn't know you were exotic till you came to the US. And I know that's been a lot of the description for African Black women, right? We're exotic creatures, and Asian male are asexual, and Black men are infantile at times. How do you see these stereotypes working out in your environment and damage or help?
It's also a very long.
I was debating what I should ask it, but we did talk about some of the similarities that are in the cultures and the things that really bring us together. And what are the outside systems that keep perpetuating these myths so that we keep being seen as separate, underrepresented groups?
Do you want to go first then?
I'll try to keep it brief.
Okay.
Let's take media into account, right? The way that Asian men have been perpetuated and have been shown in media, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's representation, is we've always been seen as undesirable, weaker. We are, like to Jerry Ann said, like asexual, and so like even Jackie Chan, right? Jackie Chan was never the sexual appeal in Hollywood films. In Rush Hour, it was in fact like it was like as if Hollywood would go out of their way to be like, oh, women have no desire in Jackie Chan, like, or Jet Li, women have no desire in Jet Li, like made it very painfully obvious, like women are attracted to you, right? So again, perpetuating this binary notion, this idea of it's very black and white, and same thing with the way that Asian women have been exoticized within the porn industry, and you go to, and where is it again? That derives from U.S. imperialism and wars that have been fought in Asian countries. So the way that we visualize and understand one another, what that is communicated through society, has a heavy impact on that. The amount of times that I grew up listening and hearing people that I would, if I would ask someone out on a date, oh, I'm not into Asian men. Anybody but you. Like, and that was the reason. Like it had nothing to do with our personality match, had nothing to do with anything else. Just the fact that who I was enough of a disqualifier right there. And then even now it's like, whenever my sister is now engaged, but all the way up until now, it's like, are you fetishizing my sister, or do you genuinely appreciate her for the human being that she is? Do you love her because you actually value her as a human being, or do you just see her as an object for your pleasure? That was a genuine fear that I held across races for my sister. And so there's also, a conversation that we have to have within the Asian American community about how the patriarchy and misogyny that exists within the way that we treat women within our communities, and how Asian men feel like there's, not all, right, but there is this generalization. Asian men feel this ownership over Asian women's bodies, and when they see them dating outside the race, there's this massive wave of violence that is just thrown at them that is just completely unfair. But yet, when an Asian man dates a white woman, is seen as we have conquered, like, and it's celebrated, and it's like this ridiculous notion that definitely ties into beyond racism, but also ties into patriarchy and misogyny. Sorry, that was not the long answer.
No, it's okay. I'll tell you a story. When I first came to the US, my father asked me one thing. He didn't ask me to study hard or anything. This is one thing: do not date American boys. And I didn't. For many, many years, I was one of those, obedient kids who was like, okay, yes, no. And the reason that my father asked of that is that in my home country, by the way, I was born and raised in Thailand, for a woman to be seen with Americans or Western men, we will automatically assumed that we were prostitutes. And he did not want that for me. And I think that, so we were talking about the challenges and the circumstances in this country. I have not talked about before about the implications of what happened in my home country. But being here, I think that to be looked at and wondering, another circumstance, the male or the bride, the people that met Asian women there in different kind of circumstances, and then for you to be questioned, how did you get here? How did you stay here? Often assumption from strangers is not good. And for you to have to experience that over and over and over all the times. And some people said, you always dress so nice, got a suit on. The answer is I cannot afford for 1 second to not look my best and seem like I'm a professional woman, because otherwise there's no room. There's no room to even be seen. I can go on, but it's a really tough question, and I think that is really real. I mean, if you minimize being seen just simply exotic and of questionable capacities, background, values,
Yeah, that is a very difficult thing, this whole thing about being exotic or whatever. My husband, who's in the audience, is from Austria. And when I studied over in Austria, it was, I often got mistaken for being a prostitute and offered, on top of the insult, not a lot of money either, rubbing salt into the wound, and the language barrier and all of that. He was also asked many times, where did you buy her? Oh, wow, she's a prize. Where did you get her? All these sorts of things that that happen, and it makes it quite difficult to always deal with, and it's always in the back of your mind, which is one reason why I will never wear heels. I love to dress up, but I cannot wear heels. I even have heels, very big heels, that I'll wear around the house, but I will never wear them outside or in public, because I will be mistaken for a hooker, a prostitute. And that, that's just, that's the way, because I find that as I'm getting older, it's stopped more. And no longer so much, but it was a real difficulty for a while there, and it affects the way you behave and the way you the way you interact with people. The minute something like that comes up, you already start to disengage, and certainly you just don't put yourself into certain positions. But it's a very difficult problem to deal with.
Sure. I don't know if is this one working? Just, Sandeep, did you want to comment or? No? Well, I've been asked to wind things up. My name is Barbara Ward, and I'm an employee at the Black Heritage Trail. I'm the senior grant writer and special projects coordinator. And it's really hard to sum up what happened in this wonderful conversation. I'm so blown away by everybody's willingness to share what their experiences have been, and to really open our eyes I think that the hope with these conversations is that we would get to some of these topics that are so important to discuss, and that, as so many of you have mentioned, it's through communication that we really begin to understand all of the issues, and how in this case, how the myth of the model minority distracts us from striving together for racial justice. But also all the nuances in that you have brought up are just incredibly, I think just incredibly important for us to have an opportunity to talk about. And we've gotten to some of the really key issues that I think we're all reading about these days, and particularly issues like the K-pop, and talking about all of the tensions that have arisen between Black and brown communities and the Asian community. And I think this has just been an incredibly important discussion. And it's our purpose as the Black Heritage Trail to create safe spaces for these kinds of dialogues and discussions. And I just thank you all so much here in the audience, both here and via Zoom, for your participation. And in this way, by understanding our history and our lived experiences, we hope to create an atmosphere in our state that will bring us together to promote a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive community here in New Hampshire. I want to thank the people who have been so instrumental in making this happen. My colleagues at the Black Heritage Trail, our Executive Director, Jerry Ann Bogus, our programming committee that includes Gina Bowker, Janine Jacks, Rita Weathersby, and Dan Comley. Some of you have met them, and you know that Dan is involved usually in making things work from afar via his computer. Thanks to Matt Toby and Bill Rogers, who have really made things work here today, and to Flynn Donovan, Aziz Gadura, who helped with the AV today, Beth Tenner for passing the mic, Khalid Wahabi and Lisa Santamango, and Abdel Tuhani from the school department, and our volunteers, Valerie Souza, Nurshoop, Ann Romney, and Kathy Wolf. And my job also is to remind you that we're going to have another conversation next week. And the Tea Talk is again, it's on Sunday, February 27th. It's happening at the Portsmouth Public Library for those who are attending in person. The title is The Lingual Divide, Y tu abuela donde está? And the panel will explore issues of colorism within the vast group of ethnicities that although joined by language and cultural experience, are really torn apart by racism within their own group. And I think that's going to be a really valuable conversation. I've been privileged to work with all of the speakers and panelists for these programs and have heard so much in the preliminary conversations. And I urge you all to attend. It's going to be a wonderful conversation. That's next Sunday, February 27th. Thank you again.